See,
This conference will now be recorded.
that always throws me off. I want to welcome everybody. I know that we have some people, some local attendees, as well as some of Dr. Mitchell's students. So to his students, thank you so much for attending this evening, and to our patrons as well. I do want to share a couple events that are coming up at the Mercer County Library System. Um, the next month is National Native American Heritage Month, and for that, we have a program on Thursday, November 4th at 7 o'clock, and it's called We Are Still Here, the History and Continuing Culture of New Jersey's Indigenous Tribal Communities. I'm very excited about this program. The presenter is a dynamic speaker. It's Reverend Dr. J.R. Norwood Jr., and he's a tribal historian who has served as the principal justice of the Tribal Supreme Court and councilman at large for the Nanticoke and Lenni Lenape Nation in New Jersey. And so he's going to give a presentation, and then it's going to be followed by a Q&A session. And again, that is on Thursday, November 4th at 7 o'clock. And then when I talked to Dr. Mitchell, one of the things we talked about is that October is LGBTQ History Month. And I'm in this thing where I don't think we have to wait for a certain month to celebrate history. So next month in November, on November 30th at 7 o'clock, which is a Tuesday, we have the History of the New Jersey Gay Men's Chorus, which I'm very excited about. It's a panel of the members, and they're going to share how the chorus started and just its evolution over its 30-year history. And again, that is on Tuesday, November 30th at 7 o'clock. And you can look for these events at more and more on our website at mcl.org, or you can download our app, which is My MCLSNJ. So that's my little spiel. So thank you for being patient during that, and hopefully we'll see you at a couple of those events. So now on to this evening's presentation. I want to welcome Dr. Christopher Mitchell. As an adjunct professor, Dr. Mitchell teaches history as well as women's and gender studies at Rutgers University Newark and Hunter College. He is currently working on a book, From Gay Ghetto to Free Market, The Economic Transformation of Queer Life in New York City, which outlines New York's queer economic and cultural history from the 1940s to 1980. Everyone sit back and let's let Dr. Mitchell get started. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you, Anna, and to thank the Mercer County Library System and also Amelia and everybody else involved. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am, as Anna said, kind of a historian more of New York City, and New Jersey often gets kind of lumped into New York City history, New York regional history, somewhat unfairly, because New Jersey really has kind of a unique history of its own. And to some extent, I think that New Yorkers don't necessarily understand that a lot of important, quote unquote, New York LGBT activists are actually New Jerseyans. And so I think that's also something that is really important. New York isn't New York without New Jersey. And I don't think that New York LGBT communities are New York LGBT communities without New Jerseyans. And so you do see a lot of interaction between these communities. And also, I might add, between Philadelphia and communities in New Jersey. So, in a lot of ways, LGBT people have not always had a great relationship with the state. So it's not like we are, necessarily treated better or worse in one of those places or the other. And there are lots of sort of connections and sort of tri-state identifications there. But I do want to think a little bit about the history of New Jersey in a couple of different ways. I want to think about the regulation of sexuality in New Jersey and how the regulation of sex and sexuality shapes the emergence of LGBT communities. And I want to think about communities in part because when you look at the history of individuals, and I will talk a little bit about some individuals in New Jersey's past, including Whitman, who is one of those tri-state folks who's kind of traversing the area. I think community is important because that's where you see people who are meeting one another, developing relationships, and ultimately developing political movements and social movements. And New Jersey is really important when you consider the history of LGBT communities. And I think it's wonderful that there is a program coming up on the Gay Men's Chorus, because these are sort of the cornerstones of our communities. Just like libraries, public libraries are sort of the cornerstone of our larger society. These are important fundamental building blocks of what make a democratic society work. So initially, that is not the history of New Jersey, right? The early sort of history of New Jersey is a history of colonization. And this area is the ancestral area of the Lenape. And while we don't know a lot about pre-contact Lenape sexual cultures, we do know that women played a much more prominent role in Lenape society. They organized the political and economic system of Lenape society in ways that were unusual to Europeans. And Europeans also noted that Lenape had sexual practices that were not necessarily in line with European norms. Lenape people did not maintain much sovereignty or control over much of New Jersey by the 18th century, when Europeans have really kind of reorganized almost the entire territory. And as they do that, a couple of different legal systems are imposed on the region. When New Jersey is first settled by Dutch and Swedish colonists between 1624 and 1644, presumably the colonial era sodomy laws would have been imposed. And sodomy laws in Sweden and the Netherlands were fairly strict, and punishments ranged from long terms of imprisonment to death. In 1644, New Jersey is reorganized under the jurisdiction of the Duke of York, and England, the British legal system, also punishes sodomy with death. So sex between men or sexual contact between men that falls under this code is severely punished. New Jersey goes through a period where there's division between East Jersey and West Jersey. West Jersey is Quaker controlled, and interestingly enough, there's no a sodomy statute mentioned for West Jersey. And East Jersey punishes sodomy with prison sentences. We don't have a whole lot of information about people that are punished for sodomy in this period. We don't have great archival or court records from this period. So a lot of this has to just kind of be reconstructed with guesswork. In the 18th century, New Jersey is reorganized by the British Empire as a crown colony, and until the Revolutionary War maintains the death penalty for sodomy. After New Jersey becomes a state, it creates a sodomy statute that requires 21 years imprisonment in solitary confinement and hard labor. So this is, effectively a life sentence in the 19th century when you consider typical life expectancy and what hard labor actually means, what it represents for your body. It's not actually used often. The sodomy law is difficult to enforce. And a sodomy law, in case we're unclear about what that is a law that criminalizes sex between men. Sex between women is not well defined or really even understood as sex because it's not penetrative. So women are not necessarily surveilled in the same way that men are. And so sex and sexuality is understood sort of differently for men and for women in this period. In the 19th century, that changes pretty dramatically. In the 1860s and 1870s, there is this a kind of newly scientific understanding of sex and sexuality, and there are connections being made between sexuality and a person's sexuality and sexual desires and sexual practices and criminology and psychology. And increasingly, there is a scientific medical consensus that homosexuality represents a perversion something that needs to be corrected. And homosexuality is understood under an umbrella with transgender identity. And in the 19th century, the physicians that would practice in New Jersey medical institutions would have probably used the term inversion to describe, what is essentially an illness. So in the second half of the 19th century, New Jersey develops like kind of this two-pronged approach to sexuality, or to the problems of sexuality. One is a medical approach, and by the early 20th century, it is possible to be essentially imprisoned in a mental institution if you're diagnosed with inversion. If you're caught in the act, and if you're a man, and if there's a witness, you can be sent to jail. And in the 1870s, New Jersey and the federal government will pass laws that restrict publications that refer to inversion in any way, right? And this also includes trans identity. So you also see some prosecutions of publishers in this period, although most of that is going to take place in New York. In 1898, New Jersey amends its Sodomy Law, and it's used as a model by other states. And basically, the Sodomy Law reduces the penalty to 10 years, but it also allows for all of these other factors, including like attempts to commit sodomy or concealment of sodomy, which can add time to a sentence. This law is also really kind of messed up because it allows people to kill somebody for attempting sodomy, and it acquits them of murder. And so it basically kind of allows a gay panic defense, right? At any rate, the sodomy law in New Jersey is on the books until the 1970s. By the 1950s and 1960s, it's not really being enforced, but you still see cases where, for example, in the 1970s, one of the final cases that's brought before the Supreme Court is a case of two men who are basically followed by the New Jersey State Police, and they are arrested while having sex in their car, and they're convicted under the sodomy law. And the Supreme Court overturns the case because they were not in public view. There was no way that they would have been seen if they weren't basically being followed illegally. So at any rate, these are the laws that are used to kind of restrict LGBT life. In the second half of the 19th century, in major cities across the country, but especially in the Northeast, including in Newark and in Paterson, you'll start to see taverns and bars that cater to people who today would probably identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans, or potentially queer. These are bars that are usually in areas that are vice districts. So Newark's history is a little bit better known. Newark was investigated by an organization called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. They were basically kind of contracted by moral reformers in New Jersey. And in 1913, they did a kind of a surveillance campaign. Actually, the Newark Historical Society had a wonderful talk 2 days ago by Professor Wittstrup, who is also a professor at Rutgers Newark. And he talked about the area around Broad Street as sort of this area where there's surveillance of people who are described by the police as, as homosexuals or inverts. And the language that's being used in the early 20th century is so very different from what we use. You'll have to forgive me for some clunky and outdated language. At any rate, in the post-war era, you start to see LGBT bars in Trenton, in Atlantic City, in New Brunswick, and in Newark and Paterson. And these bars show up in the historical record in the 50s and 60s because they're frequently raided by the New Jersey Alcoholic Beverage Control. And in some ways, the regulation of LGBT people really shifts away from the use of sodomy laws to a kind of the policing of public activity. The alcoholic beverage control is created in the 1930s in order to police the sort of culture of drinking that is created after Prohibition. In some ways, there is this kind of reform-minded commitment among New Jersey legislators not to see the bar culture of the post-Prohibition era look like the speakeasy era, where there's actually a lot of gay speakeasies, queer speakeasies, and you also have just kind of this public LGBT culture. And in fact, in the 1920s, there is a play called The Drag. It's written by Mae West, who's a famous Broadway star who goes on to become a very famous movie star in the 1930s. And it features gay characters. It features drag very prominently. And they play in a playhouse in Bayonne. And it's people love it. It's very popular, but it also incites outrage, local outrage, and so the Bayonne Police Department raid a performance in February of 1927. And this really, it kind of freaks the New York State legislature out, and so they pass a law the next month that allows state officials to padlock a theater before a play that's considered obscene can be performed. So, in the 1920s, there is this reaction to kind of a quasi-public culture of a gay life, gay and lesbian life. Although you don't see it as much in New Jersey as you do in New York City. So, New York and New Jersey have very similar legislative responses to this sort of, it's referred to as the pansy craze in the entertainment press at the time, which is to restrict this from public life. And the easiest way to do that is to keep it out of bars. So, the ABC, the alcoholic beverage control, has a unit that is responsible for making sure that gay bars don't open. But it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. These bars reopen, they use different names, or they figure out that if their customers are a little bit more discreet, they can keep their doors open, and so they enforce different kinds of rules. By the 1960s, most of these bars are, kind of well known to networks of LGBT people that know each other. But usually they're connected to larger cities like New York or Philadelphia. In some cases, they are connected to one another through medium-sized cities like Newark and Trenton. And in the 1950s and 1960s, you start to see gay publications, publications like One Magazine and the Mattachine Review. And in these publications, there are advertisements for, among other things, gay guides. And so I wanted to show you some of the gay guides that are published in the 1960s. This is a gay guide that's published in 1964 of the entire United States. It's Directory 43. And it's published by a sort of gay mail order company out of Minneapolis. And do a screen share here. So this is the document itself. I'll have to remember I'm on page 23. I'll show you what it looks like. It's not necessarily clear that this is a gay guide. Those pants are awfully tight, and the sort of silhouette or the physique is like kind of, this is where a word like queer becomes useful. It's not explicitly gay. Instead, there's just something non-normative about it, right? But if you aren't in the know, it doesn't look particularly notable at all. It's not really a terribly distinguishable guide. But you look inside, And, you know, you get some hints that this is a gay publication. So the Vagabond, a clothing company, which is, you know, one of the companies that's affiliated with the publisher of this guide, sells unusual clothes. You know, it's kind of cowboy or fetish wear. So you also see listings for physique photos. And physique photos are like, you know, photos of guys who are posing in jock straps, or in some cases in like, you know, sort of sports gear. They're sort of gay publications, but they also have this kind of veneer of heterosexuality. So at any rate, this is a company that sells that kind of stuff. The introduction says, this directory has been compiled to help you know where to go when seeking entertainment or new acquaintances. It doesn't say what kind. No place pays for its listing. All listings are from recommendations made by our readers. If you find errors or omissions, please let us know. No attempt is made to comment on the furnishings, location, or clientele of places listed in this directory, since no two persons would evaluate a place in the same way. We recommend you visit each place and make your own judgment as to the ones you prefer. Places that would be termed semi are indicated by this symbol, by a block in front of their name. And this means they're mixed, like they're both gay and straight places. It doesn't say what they are semi, you know, whatever, right? Remember that places vary from day to day and certain hours are more popular than others. When you visit the place, ask which days and hours are best, because some of these bars might have like a night where, you know, the local gay networks have decided to make this place their bar. But on other nights of the week, it might be a straight bar. And by the 1950s and 1960s, gay people even have like language to describe straight people. You know, in some places they're referred to as jam, right? So you don't want to go to a place where jam is present. Every effort has been made to make this directory accurate at time of printing. However, management of these places change, new places open, established places close, city politics change. You know, there are raids, right? Occasionally the local press gets a bee in their bonnet about, you know, like gay people hanging out and actually having a good time. And then all of a sudden there's pressure on the police, there are raids, and so there's like this kind of rhythm of bar closures and reopenings. So at any rate, when we look at the guide, there are guides for all kinds of places. It's actually surprising what you can find even in Anchorage, where there's apparently a really swinging scene. If you look down at the entry for New Jersey, let me see. You see that Atlantic City has a pretty high concentration of gay bars. So in the beach area in front of the Claridge Hotel is probably a cruising area, which is a place where people, you know, might pick up a date or a shorter term assignation. The Brass Rail on Mount Vernon Avenue, it's described as a beer bar. So this is probably a bar where the presentation of the clientele is more masculine, sort of conventional, sort of gay male bar. Eddie's Bar on Kentucky Avenue, liquor bar. And this also could just be the sort of designation that New Jersey has, or that Atlantic City has, about like where beer or liquor could be sold. I don't know. These are always like starting points for questions. This is where it's always useful to find community members. And I always tell people that are interested in oral history of their communities, you know, these guides are a great place to start, because you can go to somebody who might have been out and about in Atlantic City in the 1940s and 1950s or 60s and ask them about some of these places. The Entertainers Club at 169 Westminster, the Jockey Club at South North Carolina, Louisa's, Snake Alley, Harry Stewart Midtown Bar, and Val's, which is apparently mixed. And I'd love to know, I haven't been to AC in many years, but I'd love to know if any of these places is still open. So, and I take this guide with me whenever I visit new places, and I see what's there, what's in the old spot. In Avon by the Sea, the Buckingham, in Jersey City, the Plaza Hotel Bar, in Lambertsville, which is an unusual place to have a gay bar, Ledger's Bar, although it is awfully close to New Hope. And then Newark has Skippy's Hideaway. Although there are other gay bars in Newark in the mid 60s as well, including Murphy's, which is open by then. So Skippy's is a very famous gay bar, one of the sort of famous New Jerseyans who became central in the history of New York's Gay Activist Alliance is a guy named Arnie Kantrowitz. And Kantrowitz was born in Newark and grew up in Newark before he moved to Manhattan. And he is giving this interview where he talks about going to Skippy's, and he and one of his friends from Newark were writing letters to one another, and they were living in situations where they had to be closeted. And when they were talking about meeting gay people or having sex, they would talk about having peanut butter or eating peanut butter. That was like sort of their code word. And it was because Skippy's was like the local gay bar. So, this is from 1964. And in a minute, I'll show you a guide from the 1970s. In the late 1960s, these gay bars are raided more and more regularly. And so in 1967, 3 bars bring a case against the state of New Jersey. And the bars' names are Murphy's in Newark, and then, let me see my notes, Manny's Den in New Brunswick, and Val's in Atlantic City. And I believe, when I was a grad student at Rutgers, there was a bar in Somerset called The Den, and they had a plaque up of the news story of the raid in 1966. That was the basis of the case that Manny's Den brought against the state of New Jersey's ABC. And I believe that bar is still open. So I think it's still kind of continuously operating. The Den kind of billed itself in some ways as the Stonewall. In fact, the case is 2 years before Stonewall. And the New Jersey Supreme Court unanimously rules that the alcoholic beverage control does not have the authority to revoke a liquor license just because the clientele are gay. And they basically say, being a homosexual I think they say it might be unfortunate. I think that's the language they use, but it's not a crime. And it is a violation of the rights of these people to close down their bars. So after that point, gay bars are basically operating in the open. And New Jersey in the late 1960s also has one of the earliest gay student organizations, the Student Homophile League, which begins meeting in 1968 and officially registers with the university in 1969. And the founder of that, Lionel Cuffy, is also, one of those important activists who later becomes central to the history of activism in New York. He graduates from Rutgers in 1972 and relocates to Manhattan, where he becomes a leading member of the Gay Activists Alliance and a fairly well-known writer before tragically dying of HIV/AIDS-related illness in 1985. So at any rate, at the end of the 60s, you see a lot of student activism, and much of it is connected to activism that's taking place in New York. In 1969, in June of 1969, there is a raid on a bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall, and the the patrons, but really like the entire community of Greenwich Village kind of fought back. You know, really it was sort of frustration at continued police harassment of many residents of the neighborhood. And over the next couple of days, the initial riot was commemorated mostly by young people, mostly by people of color, by trans people, by gender nonconforming people, including Marcia P. Johnson, who was born in Elizabeth and who lived in Elizabeth and Jersey City and Newark most of her life. And while she is remembered as a New York icon, she almost always lived in New Jersey and always had family and was very close to her family in and around Elizabeth and Orange. So Johnson, if you don't know her, Johnson was born in 1945 in Elizabeth. But Johnson went on to become a founding member of the Gay Liberation Front and also one of the earliest transgender organizations in the United States. And this is really kind of how language has changed. Transgender is a term that's first coined in 1979. The word that Marcia used for herself in the early 70s was transvestite. And so the word that they used for their organization was Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. But in a lot of ways, Marcia's identity, Sylvia Rivera's identity, Sylvia Rivera is the co-founder of STAR, kind of shifted, or their identity didn't shift, but what the words they used to describe themselves shifted over the course of their lives. So this word is kind of complicated and can be used in a really transphobic way, and I just wanted to point that out. But the organization is really foundational, even though it's a New York-based organization. A lot of New Jerseyans, including Johnson, access STAR's services. STAR does provide housing early on and basically employment opportunities and social and economic support for trans people that are homeless, that are jobless, and in many cases are, you know, fleeing bad situations in New Jersey. So at any rate, the Star House is relatively short-lived. Eventually, they're evicted. Marcia Johnson remains an important activist in New York's history through the 1980s and early 1990s. And she was murdered over July 4th holiday in New York City in 1992 while she was doing activist work against basically the influence of organized crime in gay bars in Greenwich Village. So you know, it's highly likely that she was murdered for her activism. At any rate, in the early 1970s, you know, you really kind of see this shift towards gay liberation. And New Jersey is really at the center of that. Some of the oldest gay organizations, LGBT organizations in the United States are founded in New Jersey. And so New Jersey really has kind of a central history in that, including one of the oldest gay teachers associations, which I'll mention in a minute. And I realize I'm starting to run very over my 30 minutes allotted time. So I'm going to talk about you know, or I'm gonna show another guide from New Jersey in the 1970s, and it's of Atlantic City. This is another gay guide published in New York, and then I'm gonna briefly read from a book called The Gay Insider, which is you know, another kind of national view of gay places in the United States, and there's a long section on New Jersey. So this is the, are you able to see this? This is the Atlantic City Bar Guide for Michael's Thing. And Michael's Thing is a weekly gay bar guide that's published in New York City. And so you can see none of these bars, I don't think, are open except Entertainers Club. So it kind of gives you a sense of how short-lived gay bars are. This is only a few years, published a few years later. So in New Jersey, you also have, as I mentioned before, one of the oldest gay teachers organizations. So this is from the Gay Insider, published by an activist named John Francis Hunter. He's basically going around the country evaluating different gay scenes, and he does say that New Jersey is pretty groovy, and he was surprised because he's a snobby New Yorker, and he had not expected so much activism in New Jersey. And so this is his description of the Gay Teachers Caucus. Spark plug of the new Gay Teachers Caucus of the National Education Association was Gay Activist Alliance of New Jersey President John Gish of Paramus. This dynamic young reformist, whom I first caught sight of in a second march on Albany, led the caucus to the NEA convention in Atlantic City in June, determined to define ethnic as including homosexuals. While ethnic is often used to characterize national groups, Webster's Unabridged says it can designate a group by their customs as well. And this is because I think the language of the NEA at the time said that it was going to support teachers no matter their ethnic background. That's the sort of language that's being used. So the argument that Gish is putting forward is that if LGBT people are recognized on the same basis, then they should also be able to basically publicly disclose their identities. They should be able to come out in their workplace. I'm fed up with lying to them, decided Gish. I'm tired of using women to accompany me to prom so that a proper image is preserved. I'm tired of listening to anti-gay jokes in the faculty room and being forced to laugh along with the straights. Gay teachers are good teachers. Many regard their students as their own surrogate children. Many gay teachers clearly remember the bittersweet conflicts and are compassionate. So, this is, I guess, a good place to conclude so that we have a little bit of time for questions and answers. Yeah, this is like sort of the sort of activist, a sort of phase of the 1970s. And obviously there's more, and I would love to come back and offer the sequel, but I feel like I have gone fairly far. So.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? I want to make sure I'm not muted here. Everyone can hear me okay? So I mean, for me, I love that you mentioned Lionel Cuffy and of course Marcia P. Johnson, and then it was John Gish, correct, from the Teachers Gay Caucus. I think one of the things that's so interesting to me is just hearing that some of them were really kind of the first for Lionel Cuffy, that really for that student organization. And when you look at now, I mean, we have whole directories for people to look at, when they can, so they can see how diverse and how gay friendly our campuses across the United States now. So we've gone from that to something just so robust now. I did want to point out that there was a comment in the chat box. Someone had said that the den was a great place for men and women, and it moved to Somerset from New Brunswick due to revitalization. And sadly, it isn't active anymore, but the owners have a restaurant on site. And I think that speaks to how you were talking about the lifespan of some of these establishments and how they really, sometimes they weren't there very long at all.
Yeah, I do remember we had to drive out to Somerset, and like get a cab back because usually it was not a good idea to drive back to New Brunswick. But I remember the restaurant. I mean, I do think it's still kind of a gay hangout because I went to, this was pre-pandemic, but I went to the restaurant for like an LGBT mixer a couple of years ago. I think this was like maybe 2015 or 2016. One of the things that has happened is like a lot of places they're mixed now. And so, the positive aspects of, sort of liberation and toleration is that, we are everywhere and we're welcome everywhere. One of the drawbacks is we don't go to bars as much anymore because we don't need them. And so the aspects of our culture that are sometimes like unique and uniquely communal, those are less and less necessary for some people. For a lot of us, they're still just as necessary as they always were. And I do think that it's important to note, like, people have a variety of experiences when it comes to acceptance. And if their community or in school is accepting, sometimes their families aren't. And so, in some ways, when you look at these institutions, they still serve a really vital purpose.
One of the things that I think I wanted to ask about was one of the organizations, the Gay Activist Alliance of Morris County, is a very, I mean, it's existed for a long time. I can't remember, I don't know if it's the longest, but it's been around for a while. And one of the things that they've talked about is their membership has actually gone down quite a bit, even though, as we've talked about, the liberation is so wide and more accepting now. And it was interesting when you were showing the guide, which had that really discreet name like Directory 43, or it just seemed very obscure to me, very secret. And how different it is now with social media and how it's so open. And that's one of the things that they were talking about, which might be why their membership is so down, because people are finding support in other ways now.
I think that's true. And I'm surprised that they're still and glad that they're still in operation, because most other chapters of GAA closed in the 1980s. But Morris County does have a very old GAA, because I am in the GAA files frequently. And New York chapters are almost always well connected with New Jersey chapters. There's close connections, and there's coordination. And there's also this understanding that a lot of New Yorkers actually are New Jerseyans. And so Morris County is frequently in those GAA files because they're coordinating stuff. So yeah, it's funny. I'm in the LGBT marching band, and most of us live in New Jersey. So every time we have an event, I'm always in New Jersey. So we in New York's LGBT community really would not be New York's LGBT community without New Jersey. So
I agree with the fluidity that's across the border there. I mean, it's just so easy, and that was one of the things when you were showing the directory. I was surprised there wasn't more in the directory, that there weren't more establishments in northern New Jersey, that it was so far. I mean, Lambertville was shocking in its own right, but just
I thought, yeah.
I mean, Atlantic City I can understand, but I thought that there would be more up north, but it didn't seem that way.
Well, and also that is, because the guide comes out of Minnesota, I don't know how well connected they are. And I use this guide, and I'll cross-reference it against other ones. And I am mostly looking at New York. But when I do, I don't see a lot of accuracy in Directory 43. So I don't know
Okay.
how complete it is. And it's not, the information isn't wrong, but it's often sketchy. So it's like, it'll say it's near 6th Street, and then I can find a directory where it tells me like what the actual address is.
Oh, interesting.
So that's why I say it's a great starting point. And what I need to do is, and if I were a New Jersey historian, I promise I would do this, but find somebody in AC in the 1960s and ask them what it was like to go to these bars, or if they remembered these bars or these places. So, and somebody does, right? So, and
I do want to invite our participants that they're more than welcome to ask a question. Just so you can type it in the chat. Looks like a little speech bubble, and like a little reading a graphic novel or a comic strip. I do have another question. I know I feel like I'm do you think I think you mentioned this in your talk, was talking about the oral histories. And do you know of any active projects going on with either New York or New Jersey, or I guess anywhere with any type of oral history collection?
I absolutely do. Thank you so much. You know, I can be very absent-minded. The Newark Oral History Project is the absolute best oral history project online anywhere. And you know, they have more and more interviews every time I log into that site. Really good, really complete interviews with some really important people. Yes, I highly recommend that. And I use it a lot in my class as well. Most of the interviews are with people who have been active since the 60s and 70s. So it's also you know, an archive that goes back pretty far. So I think that, and then a lot of stuff on like the 80s and 90s, and you know, Newark was a center, and I think still is a center of ballroom culture. And so, you know, there's a lot of really, really rich material in that archive.
I'll have to check that out. Thank you so much for recommending that.
I can probably link it too.
Oh, you're putting the link into the chat for us.
I am, yeah.
Thank you. I see it there. Thank you so much. So queer.newark.rutgers.edu.
Yes, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And if no one has any questions, I've been a total question hog tonight. I'm sorry. But I do appreciate the time that you took. I know that you were very busy and you've had a long day of teaching. And again, I want to thank Amelia from our IT department for helping us this evening. And of course, thank everyone for coming this evening. So we hope to see you again soon, and stay safe out there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for letting us record it so other people will be able